Hey there, deep divers. Have you ever gotten that deer in the headlights feeling when you're facing way too many options? Like you're pumped to pick out a new phone and then bam, 50 different models, your brain just freezes up.
Yeah, it's a super common experience. And you know what? There's a whole bunch of research on this. It's called choice overload.
Oh yeah, choice overload. I've heard of it, but to be honest with you, I haven't really looked into what it really means.
Well, get ready because we're about to do a deep dive into it. Choice overload basically means that even though having options is usually a good thing, there's a point where too many choices can actually lead to bad stuff.
Bad stuff. What do you mean? Isn't it always better to have more options, just
Yeah,
just in case?
you would think so, right? But research is showing that when we've got tons of choices, we can end up feeling less satisfied with the choice we finally make. We might even get all anxious or regretful, or even just completely avoid making a decision at all.
Whoa. I can totally relate to that. I remember one time I spent hours trying to pick a new blender online, and I just gave up and ordered takeout because I was so overwhelmed.
That's a perfect example of choice overload happening right there. And it's not just blenders or online shopping. This whole concept applies to all kinds of choices, from picking a retirement plan to figuring out what you want to major in college.
So how did this idea of choice overload even come about? Is it like a brand new thing, or has it been around for a while?
Well, research on choice overload really took off in the late 90s and early 2000s. One of the big studies that got everyone talking was the JAM study by Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper. Does that ring a bell?
Vaguely. Remind me about it.
They had a jam tasting booth at a fancy food store, and sometimes they had 24 different flavors of jam, and other times they only had 6.
Okay. I think I see where you're going with this. I bet more people stopped by when there was more jam to try, right?
You got it. The
Yeah.
display with 24 jams was way more popular. But here's the catch. Only 3% of the people who went to the big display actually bought a jar of jam, but 30% of the people who saw the smaller display ended up buying something.
Wait, so more people were interested in the bigger selection, but they were way less likely to actually buy anything. That's wild.
Exactly. And that's one of the main things that really put choice overload on the map. It showed that too many choices can be a turnoff, even when we're talking about yummy stuff like jam.
Wow, that jam study is blowing my mind. It makes total sense now that you explain it. But I'm curious, is choice overload like a universal thing? Does everyone freak out the same way when they have too many choices?
That's a great question, and it takes us to some even cooler research. While choice overload is pretty common, there are things that can change how we experience it. And some studies are even saying that the effect can completely reverse depending on the situation.
Reverse. You mean having too many choices could be a good thing. I'm all ears.
Let's look at a 2012 paper by Evan Pullman. He and his team did a bunch of studies looking at how what we want and who we're choosing for can change how we feel about choice overload.
Ooh, now this is getting interesting. So he was looking at if we react differently to lots of choices, depending on if we're picking something for ourselves or for someone else.
You got it. In one study, he had people pick paint colors, either for their own bedroom or for somebody else's, and they could pick from a small set of colors or a massive set.
I'm already trying to guess what happened. Okay, so if they were choosing for themselves, they probably felt overwhelmed by the huge selection, right? Classic choice overload.
Right on. They were less happy with their paint choice when they had a ton of options. But here's the crazy part. People choosing for someone else were actually more satisfied when they had a bigger selection to pick from.
Hold on, the choice overload thing actually flipped when they were picking for someone else. Why would that happen?
Paulman thinks it's all about a shift in what we're focusing on. He uses something called regulatory focus theory to explain it. When we're picking for ourselves, we're usually more cautious and worried about messing up. We're in what's called a prevention focus.
So it's like we're trying to dodge a bad outcome, like buyer's remorse.
Exactly. But when we're choosing for someone else, our focus changes. We get more concerned with finding the absolute best thing for that person, even if it means going through a ton of choices. This is called a promotion focus.
Makes sense to me. Like if it's for me, I might just go with a good enough option. But if it's a gift for my best friend, I'm going to put in the work to find something really awesome.
It's like we go from avoiding something bad to trying to get the best possible outcome. And that shift seems to change how we feel about having lots of choices. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, we might actually feel more excited and ready to explore all the possibilities.
Okay, that's fascinating. Choice overload isn't as simple as we might think. It's not just about how many choices there are. It's also about who we're choosing for and what we're trying to achieve.
You got it. And Pullman didn't stop there. He also looked into whether social distance matters in this whole reversal effect.
Social distance, you mean like if we're close to the person we're choosing for?
Exactly. And his findings say, yep, it does matter. The reversal effect was strongest when the choice was for someone close, like family or a good friend.
Oh, yeah, I totally get that. Like, I'm way more likely to spend hours stressing over a birthday present for my sister than for some coworker I barely know.
It's like the closer we are to the person, the more we want to find that perfect thing, and the more we might actually like having a bunch of choices.
This is so interesting. I'm starting to rethink how I do gift giving. But before we move on, can we go back to something you said earlier? You said that some research says choice overload isn't always bad.
That's right. There's this study by Moser and her team from 2017 that adds another layer to this whole thing. They did an experiment with buying chocolate online.
Chocolate. I'm listening.
Their study was different because they didn't just look at two different sizes of choice sets like Pullman. They tested a whole range from 12 options up to 72 to see if there was a sweet spot for being happy with your choice.
Wow, 72 types of chocolate. That's a tough decision.
I know, right? But get this, they didn't really find that classic choice overload effect where you get less satisfied as the choices go up.
So maybe choice overload isn't as universal as some of the earlier research made it seem.
Could be. What kind of choice it is like online versus in a store or even what you're buying could change how you feel about it.
That's true. I definitely feel differently when I'm looking at clothes online compared to trying them on in a store.
But here's something they found that's really interesting. Their research showed that people who are maximizers weren't as happy with their choices as people who are satisficers.
Hold up, I need a definition here. Maximizers and satisficers. What are we talking about?
Good question. Maximizers are the people who are always trying to find the absolute best option, even if it takes forever. They're the ones reading every single online review and comparing every little feature.
Oh yeah, I know a few people like that. They can tune a quick shopping trip into a whole research project.
Right. And then you've got the satisficers. They're happy to go with a good enough option as long as it does what they need. Doesn't have to be the best. They just want something that works and makes them happy.
So it sounds like even if the number of choices doesn't affect everyone's happiness, the way we make decisions definitely matters.
For sure. And this opens up a whole new set of questions about how we can get better at making decisions, especially with more and more choices all the time.
This is all super fascinating. We've talked about jam tasting and paint colors and chocolate. I'm already starting to see how choice overload happens in my own life.
That's what I love about doing these deep dives. It helps us understand this stuff and how it affects us every day.
Speaking of which, I really want to hear about some real-world examples of how this research is being used.
Oh, there's some really interesting examples, especially in marketing, product design, and even healthcare.
Tell me everything. This is where it gets really interesting for me. How is this research actually being used to make things better?
Well, let's start with marketing. Companies are realizing that having way too many products can actually be a bad thing. They're using this whole choice overload idea to offer fewer products and make shopping less overwhelming for people.
So instead of 50 versions of the same thing, they might just have a few.
Yep. They're going for quality over quantity and showing off the important features so people can make good decisions without drowning in options.
That makes sense. I've totally walked away from buying something because there were just too many options. Like I just need a decent laptop. I don't want to compare processors and RAM and all that.
Exactly. And by simplifying what they offer, companies can actually make customers happier and sell more stuff. Everybody wins.
Okay, so that's marketing. What about designing products? How does choice overload affect that?
Think about all the apps and websites we use. A lot of them have this problem called feature creep, where they just keep adding more features, more buttons, more options. They think more is always better. Ugh, I hate that. I've seen apps that are so cluttered, I can't even figure out how to do the one thing I downloaded it for. Where's the send a message button in all this mess?
I know, right? And that's where choice overload comes in. People who design products are starting to realize that a clean, simple interface with just a few well-designed features can make things so much better.
So less is more sometimes.
Exactly. It's about figuring out what's really important for people and making those things easy to find and use.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got marketing and product design. What about healthcare? That's a place where making good decisions is really, really important.
Absolutely. Choice overload can have some pretty big effects in healthcare, both for patients and doctors.
How so?
Imagine a patient who has a bunch of treatment options for something serious. If they're hit with a ton of information all at once, it can be super overwhelming. They might feel like they have to decide before they really understand everything.
That sounds really tough. I can see how choice overload could make it harder to make a good decision in that kind of situation. Exactly. And it's not just the patients. Doctors can feel overwhelmed too when they're trying to figure out the best treatment. especially if they feel pressure from other doctors or administrators or even the patients themselves.
So a doctor might see all the different treatments and just freeze up,
Hmm.
especially if there's no clear best option.
Yeah. And this can lead to what we talked about before, that shift to prevention focus, where the doctor just wants to avoid doing something wrong, even if it means picking a treatment that's not the best for the patient.
Wow, that's a really important thing to think about. Choice overload can have serious consequences in healthcare because those decisions can literally be life or death.
No doubt. And that's why researchers and doctors are trying to find ways to deal with choice overload in healthcare.
Like what kind of things?
One thing is using decision aids like interactive tools or pamphlets that break down complex medical info into smaller pieces, so patients can understand the pros and cons of each treatment option.
So it's like giving them a roadmap instead of just throwing a map at them.
Exactly. And some hospitals are trying out shared decision making, where doctors and patients work together to make the decision. They think about the patient's values and what they want and how they live their life.
That sounds really good. Giving patients more control and helping them avoid feeling overwhelmed.
It's a good step. And as we learn more about choice overload, I think we'll see even more creative solutions, not just in healthcare, but in every part of life where we have to make choices.
So we've talked about the research, the downsides of choice overload, and some cool real-world examples. What about the future? Where do you see this research going from here?
Well, there's still a ton we don't know, and so many exciting things to explore.
Like what?
One thing I'm really interested in is how technology affects choice overload. Think about how the internet and social media have given us way more choices than ever before.
It's true. It's like choice overload times 1,000. We're always bombarded with options. What to watch, what to eat, what to buy.
Exactly. And I think we need to understand how these technologies are changing how we make decisions. Are they helping us, or are they just making choice overload worse?
It's a good question. It feels like a double-edged sword. We have access to so much more, but it's also so easy to get lost in it all.
Right. And that's where more research can help. We need to find ways to use technology without getting the bad effects. Like, what if we had really good recommendation algorithms that knew what we like and what we want?
That would be amazing. It's like having a personal AI shopper that cuts through all the noise.
Exactly. Another area that's really interesting is whether we can train ourselves to be better decision makers, even when there are tons of choices.
Can we really learn to deal with choice overload?
Well, there's some promising research that says certain mindfulness techniques can help. Like, if we focus on what's important to us, we can make better choices even when we have lots of options.
So it's not just about the choices themselves, it's also about what's going on in our own heads.
Yeah. And I think that's a powerful message. We're not just stuck with choice overload. We can take control and learn to make choices that fit our values and goals.
Okay. I'm feeling a lot better about this whole choice overload thing now.
Mhm.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What's the big picture?
I think the most important thing to remember is that choice overload is a real thing. It's not just about feeling a little annoyed when you're at the grocery store. It can really mess with our happiness, our well-being, and our ability to make important decisions.
It's like our brains are hardwired to react in a certain way to too many choices, and sometimes that can be a bad thing.
Exactly. But the good news is that if we understand how choice overload works, we can start making smarter choices that match what we care about. We can learn to simplify things and focus on what really matters.
So it's not about getting rid of choices altogether. It's about being more mindful about how we deal with them.
Absolutely. And if you can do that, we can turn choice overload from a source of stress into an opportunity to grow and discover new things.
This has been an awesome deep dive. I'm already looking at the world differently, and I'm going to be more aware of how I react to choice overload.
I'm glad to hear that. The best deep dives are the ones that make you think and inspire you to change things.
So deep divers, we hope this has given you something to think about. Now we want to leave you with something to ponder. Think about a time when you felt that choice overload thing kicking in. Maybe trying to pick a movie on Netflix or finding some new headphones.
Now think about this. Did it feel different depending on if you were choosing for yourself or for someone else?
That's a really good question. You got to think about that. Did any of the research we talked about hit home for you?
I think the biggest thing for me was realizing how much my motivation changes things. Like, if I'm picking for someone else, I get way more into it. I used to think I was just bad at making decisions, but now I'm thinking maybe I just get more excited about finding the perfect thing when it's for someone I care about.
Totally. I'm realizing that I actually kind of like the whole gift-giving thing because of that promotion focus. It's like I'm not just trying to avoid getting a bad gift. I'm actually looking for something amazing that they'll really love.
Exactly. And I think knowing that can help us deal with choice overload in a better way. Instead of seeing it as a bad thing, we can see it as a chance to be creative and show we care.
I love that. Instead of freaking out about making the wrong choice,
Hmm.
we can try to find something really special.
And remember, even if we do get overwhelmed by choices, it's not like we're doing something wrong. It's just a normal human thing.
True. We're all just trying to figure out how to deal with all these choices.
And that's why these deep dives are so cool. They help us step back and think about our own experiences and learn from the research.
For sure. And we hope this deep dive has given you some new ideas and some tools for dealing with choice overload in your own life.
So next time you're looking at a million options, take a breath. Think about why you're choosing. And don't be afraid to simplify things or even just walk away.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into choice overload. We'll see you next time for another awesome exploration of the human mind.